Thank you so much, Jenna, and welcome back to Aspen, Doug.
Thank you.
It's an honor and a pleasure to get to speak with you today. So you've referred to yourself as a presidential historian, but really your work covers the sweep of American history over the last century. To introduce our talk and lay the groundwork, I'm curious what motivated you to pull the conservation thread from the tapestry of American history and tell these particular stories.
Well, it's incredibly fun to be here, and I never turned down an opportunity to come to Aspen, so thank you. And I'm very touched that somebody came, so thank you. You truly are living in the Magic Valley, and I come here as often as humanly possible. We had a nice day today. We had a lunch up on the mountain, a group of us. It was beautiful. I just love the writer Henry David Thoreau. I was one of those kids who read Walden, and it stayed with me all these years later, and his book Cape Cod, and all of his writings have always meant a lot to me. But when you do your doctorate, I did mine in Cold War history, presidential history, and I decided to write a book on Theodore Roosevelt called The Wilderness Warrior. And it really was about how TR was born in 1858, and Charles Darwin's On the Origins of Species came out in 59, and what a revolution Darwin was. And Theodore Roosevelt's father was the founder of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And so young TR, growing up in New York, where his mother, Theodore Roosevelt's mom, was a Bullock from Georgia and was for the Confederates, and his father was, Knickerbocker for, Grant and Lincoln and the rest. They were feuding in their house all the time during the Civil War, and young Theodore Roosevelt decided that the new Eden was the West, that the South had ruined things with slavery and the North had hyper-industrialization, but anything was possible in the West. And TR started traveling out to places like Carroll County, Iowa, to go grouse hunting. He'd then go to the Red River Valley by Fargo, North Dakota, Moorhead. And then when TR's mother and wife died on the same Valentine's Day, one of the most dramatic documents I've ever seen is TR's diary, where he puts a giant X and says, essentially, the light has gone out of my life forever. And TR, brooding with depression, his brother had committed suicide, Elliot, jumped out of a window. The family had a history of it. His sister said, go west. You always seem happy when you're in the West. And Theodore Roosevelt took the Northern Pacific Railroad from New York all the way to Medora, North Dakota, where the railroad left off, and it began his years in the wilderness. And his vision from over there was to start bringing back species, bring back the bison, bring back elk, he wrote a book later as president called The Deer Family. He wrote about the Little Missouri River and grasslands. And so how remarkable to study a president who did so much in the realm of environmentalism, as we call it today, conservation, and the fact that he saved 234 million acres of wild America, public lands that we all enjoy so much today. And when I started writing that book, I realized that I needed to tell the whole story, that nobody's ever done a multiple volume environmental history. In a perfect world, I may have begun with Thoreau, but the truth of the matter was, until there was Theodore Roosevelt, there was no such thing as really conservation policy thinking. And so in a modern context, he's the perfect person to begin with. And I did Theodore Roosevelt, and then I did a book on FDR and Ickes called Rightful Heritage of that second wave. And now I'm writing a third wave, and I'm connecting presidents with environmental history.
How fascinating to follow that thread through all of the other intersecting things that were occurring during those time periods. And it's a really incredible work. I think that today many of us take for granted the regulations that uphold our access to clean water and clean soil, clean air, and sanitation infrastructure. But Silent Spring Revolution illustrates that it really wasn't so long ago, only 60 years ago, that those public health and environmental standards not only were very different, but many of them didn't exist. So what changed all that?
The big starting point in my book, and really in the times we live, is World War II. In order to win the war, it was a hurry-up, rushed economy, and there were no regulations. Anything went, and a lot of incredible things occurred due to industrial mobilization, including executive power by with the movie Oppenheimer so popular now, FDR creating the Manhattan Project, with atomic weapons. And by the end of World War II, though, people started looking that our technology was running amok, that who was regulating the chemicals, who was radiating pharmaceutical, or looking at what pharmaceuticals could bring. And there was a feel we didn't have enough of a regulatory structure. There was no EPA. There was no National Sewage Treatment Standard. There was no Clean Air Act or Clean Water Acts. And I think the jarring moment, in addition to Hiroshima, was the amount of nuclear testing we did in Nevada, and that would drift all over the country and make people ill from nuclear testing. As I mentioned to you at lunch, 1,054 nuclear weapons detonated in the United States from 1946 to 1991. And so there became these strands after World War II of anti-DDT people. DDT was a miracle. All of us would have been sprayed with it. If I fought in the Pacific War, it killed mosquitoes and ticks and, spray me with DDT. But a couple of people were very environmentally sensitive to it. One was named Barry Commoner, who later ran for president and ran out of Washington University in St. Louis and later in Brooklyn. A genius, Barry Commoner, of Einstein almost proportions.
And an initial leader of the environmental justice movement as well.
Leader in environmental justice. But people don't realize to win the war, Barry Commoner created the mechanism to spray DDT.
No way.
Yeah, and he started
kidding.
recognizing what it was doing to the wildlife.
Wow.
And when he got back, he got scientists involved to studying whether this was really a miracle DDT or something very detrimental, not just to wildlife, but hence humans. And Commoner was right. There was something wrong with it. And Rachel Carson, who I write about, working on fish and wildlife, are a great writer of the seas. If you take anything away from me being here tonight, read Rachel Carson's sea trilogies about oceans. They are so beautiful. But she started joining anti-DDT. And by that meaning, let's regulate pesticides. Let's make sure what we're putting into our bodies and water streams, et cetera. There was also a wilderness lobby, people that just wanted big, particularly in the West, large portions of land with no roads. Ever since the Wilderness Society was created in 1935, there was a bit of a movement to say roads bring in telephone poles, they bring in ski lifts, they bring in sewage, they bring in modernity. So if you just don't allow any roads, you would be able to have big, vast parcels of wilderness. Now, wilderness lobbies, the anti-nuclear movement gets a big success with John F. Kennedy signing the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning the testing of atmospheric and underwater weapons. But the wilderness movement lane got its big win when Lyndon Johnson signs the Wilderness Act, putting aside 9.1 million acres of wild America with a system that just keeps on growing. And those two started meeting. At the same time, there became a new interest in seashore and lakeshore preservation. And the country was trying to recognize everybody was New Jerseyization of the ocean fronts, boardwalks and jetties and this, and there wasn't pure beach left. And Kennedy, following on a movement of seashore preservations like Rachel Carson, saved Point Reyes out in Marin County, California, spectacular area. Padre Island, Texas, on the Gulf from development, a big piece of the Gulf shore. Cape Cod National Seashore in the east. And then we started adding all these lake shores. Andrew Travers, who used to work with me, and a great friend of mine who's here with his wife tonight, they've spent a lot of time at the Apostle Islands. And Gaylord Nelson was the big promoter of that. He's the so-called progenitor of Earth Day, 1970, the first one. So this stuff, these different seashore preservation, wilderness, anti-DDT, nuclear, they were all kind of emerging. And then add Ralph Nader, consumerism, and going after auto companies with unsafe at any speed in 1965. And it became ripe as a people's movement, and the politicians woke up because the public was demanding, why can't we have clean air in Los Angeles? Smog was horrible in LA, guys.
Wow.
Some of you remember. You couldn't, it was atrocious. Or Lake Erie, near where I grew up, dead. It was dying. It's one of the great fisheries in the world. And so there became a national movement to save or clean American air, water, endangered species and start trying to save pockets of wilderness.
Wow, it's so interesting to hear about how the places that people were individually connected to helped the movement build power as a whole.
You know, I'll ask all of you, and if we're in a book signing, maybe you can tell me that Henry David Thoreau, question, and he would say, in wildness is the preservation of the world. It's a heavy comment if you really want to bore down on it, but I ask all of you, what's your Walden Pond? Is it the Maroon Bells? Is it your grandmother's farm in Kansas? Is it, meaning what place in your life that you've experienced nature in a way that has almost become part of your soul and your spirit and sense of self? And people have a Walden, and if I went around, there might be 20 of them, but if I forced you to boil down, you say, well, I'll have to pick this. And so my three presidents in this book weren't like the Roosevelts, naturalists by heart. Both TR and FDR called himself. Whenever Franklin Roosevelt filled out a form for occupation, he would write tree farmer. And he ran during World War II, he would take out ads in the New York Times, FDR, having New Deal Christmas, buy a tree from Roosevelt Farms, and would sell them off the Hudson River. And he really understood scientific forestry in a deep way, FDR. Also saved 800 state parks in some of our more iconic parks. He went, FDR, to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, and went and he saw how somebody clear-cut a field of the trees, and he stopped the entourage. And Roosevelt said, screams to the media here, "Who did this? Who cleared this field? I hope they burn in hell." Because he wasn't against wood, but there was proper ways to, as you all know, to deal with forestry and not just doing that flatten the mountain kind of bit.
Wow.
And the same thing, just what's on my mind with FDR, with wilderness, the really first real wilderness was Kings Canyon National Park in California, in the part of the High Sierras. And a young, unknown photographer, Ansel Adams, took all these photos, and like you showed me that book on Aspen a little bit that's just coming out. This was a little like mom and pop localized little book he did of Kings Canyon. Well, Harold Ickes, Interior Secretary, got a copy. There must have been 200 copies of this first little Ansel Adams thing. And Ickes brought it to Roosevelt and brought Ansel Adams into the White House, a young photographer. And because Eleanor would say, Franklin will save anything if you show him the pretty pictures. And Ickes wanted it saved as a roadless wilderness in California, no roads. And Roosevelt was awed by Ansel Adams' photos, as all of us would be. And then Roosevelt looked at him and said, well, I have one question. If I sign this as an executive order, how will I ever get to see it? He was in a wheelchair. He couldn't. It was for backpackers and hikers. And if you didn't have a road with the vistas where you pull off and look, and they said, well, you won't be able to. I guess you wouldn't be able to.
Before airplanes, I
right.
guess.
Yeah, except over, but you couldn't explore
it. But he couldn't be there.
And he asked that seminal question for handicapped, if you like a question. And he said, well, I'm going to do it. Let's do it, and signed it at any rate. And that became our first great, wilderness king in Kings Canyon there. Oh, wow. But their Walden, Kennedy, Atlantic Seaboard, Cape Cod. Ocean. He has blue mind. Has to be near water, Kennedy, from Palm Beach to Hyannis, but Martha's Vineyard, et cetera. But even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's doodling of ocean sailboats. It's the ocean as a wilderness and as a seashore maritime culture. LBJ, the Pedernales River, Texas Hill Country. On Texas, in those days, you judged a person of their stewardship of their land, and he fell in love with that particular river, which is quite beautiful. Nixon didn't have a Walden, okay? But he lived in San Clemente over the ocean and was a whale watcher, which people don't really know. He came up with the idea of mammal protection, federal legislation to protect whales when he was there. And also Nixon, out of his own accord, came up with the idea of taking military bases and using the unused land as wildlife reserves. And it happens around the United States now. You have a lot of acreage and you're using, but some of the other ones you can bring in naturalists, conservationists, et cetera, and maintain that. So Nick, and when I met with Ed Cox, any of you remember Ed Cox, married to Tricia Nixon? I was in New York in Wall Street at an event, and he said, I said, I've been trying to reach your wife about what your all that Nixon did, EPA, clean air, water. She said, you academics, liberals, nobody will give with Richard Nixon, my father-in-law, a fair break, so we just don't talk to anybody. I said, well, I will. I'd like to talk to him about why he did these things with the environment. And lo and behold, she wrote me a long letter, Tricia Nixon. And some of it was like he used to feed a deer called Nibbles, But she put in there things about that convinced me enough that Nixon had a side to him, like he chose to give sequoia redwoods as a symbol of America in exchange for the panda bear, and when the pandas got in the National Zoo, Nixon would call the zookeeper all the time, checking on their health and what are you feeding them, and he created the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Nixon, in bed with the Sierra Club, David Brower, they did it together. Nixon stopped a jet port from being built that would have ruined the Everglades in Florida. So, he was surprising in those ways because of somebody that never put nature on the top of his resume, but nevertheless heard the people saying, we got to save this beautiful country, and he did some extraordinary things.
Yeah, and together those three presidents, JFK, LBJ, and Richard Nixon, oversaw just a staggering number of landmark conservation laws.
They did. It was the last, people here like National Park World, it's the last chance to get some of the big ones in. Stuart Udall was the Interior Secretary, who was amazing during Kennedy Johnson. They got Canyonlands done in Utah. North Cascades battle up in Washington was fierce. That got saved. Redwood National Park, Lady Bird Johnson. No first lady has ever been associated with conservation like she was. Highway beautifications, anti-billboard, et cetera. But the big life-changing legislation are the Clean Air Act of December 1963 attacked stationary pollution from factories. And that genesis is in the late 40s, Denora, Pennsylvania. The whole city got ill from poison air. People died, and everybody in town got a respiratory disease. It could be a Stephen King horror show in Denora, Pennsylvania. And that started leading because up until the 63 law, there was no federal air law. Every state could create their own. Well, what good does it do for one state to have Massachusetts not to pollute when Connecticut is, and so it begged federal law. And Ed Muskie of Maine was a big part of some of that. And then the second Clean Air, 1970, Nixon was all over that, going after automobile pollution, getting rid of leaded gasoline. We forget what a big, lowering the speed limit to 55 miles an hour. There were all these efforts underway and Clean Water Act of 72 is game-changing. And then, of course, the Environmental Protection Agency of 1970 and NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, which creates environmental impact statements. Nixon surprised everybody and signed that on January 1, 1970. It was Scoop Jackson, a Democrat, and Congressman Dingell's legislation. But Nixon so hated, the man who kept enemies lists, so hated Ed Muskie and George McGovern. And he said, they're going to get credit for stuff. I'm going to be the environmental president. And he signed it as a kind of one-upsman. And then his State of the Union address most of it was about the environment in 1970. And that a couple weeks later was the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970.
So interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. Why and how did her book become so important? And I was wondering if you could share an anecdote with us or an interaction that might give us a deeper understanding of who she was.
You can't deal with somebody of more accomplishment and brilliance and decency than Rachel Carson. She was everything you think a human can be. She was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. The Allegheny River was polluted. As a young girl, she loved the natural world, Like a lot of early naturalist, environmentalist, bird life mattered a lot to her. She collected fossils and things. But her break came, she went to a place called Chatham School for Girls or Women. Today it's Chatham University. And there she met a teacher that said, Rachel, you're gifted. You can do creative writing and your science. So morph them. I mean, Darwin morphed them. He could write well, Darwin. And,
Right.
you know,
Oh, yeah.
and she then got a scholarship and went to Woods Hole in Massachusetts, just down the road from the Kennedy compound in Hyannis. And Woods Hole was, and then, like the Harvard and Carnegie Hall of ocean studies. And she had never seen the ocean before, and now she was watching boats coming in with new creatures and studying them. And her first intense interest became migratory eels, because the birds had been covered. Now this is this is pre-DNA, pre-bird banning, modern videoing and all that we do. But nobody had documented eels, and she couldn't believe an eel that ends up in a river in Pennsylvania came from Africa. How do they migrate like that?
Wow.
So she started doing a lot of research, went to zoology at Johns Hopkins, and got hired to work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which FDR created. Theodore Roosevelt created 51 federal bird reservations with executive fiat. The first was in Florida, Pelican Island, where he brought a couple lawyers into the White House in the room, and there was a feather war. Anybody coming to me 100 years ago here would have worn I know you women here will say you wouldn't have. You would have worn a bonnet with an ornamental feather to come to a public lecture. And they were killing the birds, wiping them out in Florida, because you had guns that could go, the rookeries, the birds don't leave, and you just machine gun them down, pluck their perfect feathers for fashion, steal the eggs. So species were going extinct. The flamingo, which used to be ubiquitous in Florida, had disappeared. And it was a real problem. It's a feather mafia in Florida. In fact, the TRs appointed 4 U.S. Department of Agriculture wardens, and 2 of the 4 were murdered, point blank, for protecting bird rookeries.
Wow.
So it was a war down there over this, because you're dealing with Florida, right, not that far after the Civil War. And the federal government is saying you're going to go to jail if you shoot an egret. They didn't buy into that in Florida. It was, screw you, it's my property, the bird's on my property, I can do what I want kind of thing. So Roosevelt met him, and they said, well, Mr. President, he said, what if I declare this whole part of Florida a federal bird reservation with no humans are allowed, only scientists or people that register in for reasons of naturalist studies? And they said, well, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I so declare it. Signed it, and then did 51. One of them, the Yukon Delta of today in Alaska, is the size of West Virginia. And that was very unique because it was land gifted to the species. It wasn't multiple use. It was given to wildlife, given to animals. And and so the Carson out of those 51 grew U.S. Fish and Wildlife. FDR created it in 1940. You all own over 550 national wildlife refuges. And she would, during World War II, Rachel Carson did radio reports on birds, fish. She wrote for the Baltimore Sun about shad and other fish stocks. And after the war, starting in the 1940s, she started writing for the Atlantic about undersea worlds, and then wrote 3 books that spiked up the bestsellers list, her Sea trilogy. And her biggest fan was Rose Kennedy, and the Kennedy family worshiped Rachel Carson. She lived in a house in Silver Spring, Maryland, but her real soul, her Walden, was the rock rib coast of Maine. And she would spend her summers in Maine and wrote these beautiful books. Only Jacques Cousteau and Rachel Carson, they were like the people of talking about ocean lives. And so Rachel Carson would have happy to have been the ocean writer, winning every National Book Awards and, winning every award known to man. But she knew DDT was poisonous. And she had friends that in government that had done field experiments on birds, raptors, and fish. And her friend Marjorie Spock, the daughter of Benjamin Spock, the baby doctor, the sister of Dr. Spock, sued because she was an organic farmer in New York on Suffolk County, and she sued because we were spraying, the U.S. government was spraying to kill insects, pesticides, DDT type of chemicals over her organic farm. And she said, you are taking away my right to be an organic farmer. And went all the way to Supreme Court, and she lost. But Rachel Carson inherited all of the trove of legal papers because she had befriended Marjorie Spock. And then she also had insider reports from biologists and government. And she was diagnosed with breast cancer in the late 50s and started writing. She dies in 1964, but she started writing the book Silent Spring, which came out first serialized in the New Yorker, and then the book came out in the fall of 1962. And John F. Kennedy, as president, liked her, backed her, stood up for her when the chemical industries were trying to destroy her, and put a scientific panel to look into her claims and found out that indeed she was right. But yet the chemical industry, like fossil fuel industry or something, they're so powerful a lobby, they refused to give up on DDT, and so we call it the DDT Wars. It went on from Rachel Carson's book in 1962 to 1972, when the Nixon administration under the EPA abolished DDT in North America. And out of Rachel Carson bringing public health into saving of wild and special places, Rooseveltian conservation meets Rachel Carson and public health, is born the modern environmental movement that we call the 60s environmental movement.
Wow, what a story. So let's talk about some of the ties and connections between the environmental movement and the civil rights movement, which was happening concurrently. How did those two movements and some of the key people involved work together to achieve some common goals, such as the 1972 DDT ban?
One of the most underrated figures in American history of this period is Coretta Scott King. She was very into ecology. She had graduated from Antioch in Ohio, Yellow Springs, very progressive place, and she became the leader with a man named Norman Cousins of SANE, stopping nuclear testing. She loved the natural world. When Martin Luther King was killed, and we all remember Memphis, you don't ask, where did Coretta take the kids? She went up to New Hampshire and lived in the wild, way away from everybody. She was very happy in a woods and natural environment. And she was really starting to push what today we call environmental justice issues, which are, and Dr. King, of course, got killed at a sanitation strike in Memphis. The question being, why are the ugly parts of industrialization, our toxic debris, always placed upon people of color, particularly black communities, Native Americans, Latinos? And it's just a fact. We would, people don't want to be, put it where the poor people are. And there became stirrings in the 60s, most notably and bravely. I get to interview her in 3 weeks, Dolores Huerta, who's in her 90s.
Oh, my goodness.
And with Cesar Chavez out in California, fighting against pesticides because of the proof that they were causing deformed babies and the problems of those blanket sprayings in the San Joaquin and Imperial Valleys of California. And so they're early environmental justice pioneers. But the real movement in a modern sense comes, guys, because of Earth Day, 1970. Nixon was very paranoid about Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. He signed this stuff, but he thought he wrote a letter. Only Nixon would actually put this in writing. He said, "I'm worried it's a pinko commie plot." Exact words. To undermine me. He saw the direct correlation between the anti-Vietnam War movement and Earth Day. And now he was signing all this stuff, and the media gave him some, a little bit of applause for what he did, but not thought he wasn't getting the love that he deserved from Greens or environmentalists. And he then asked the fundamental question, how are these Earth Day offices popping up everywhere? Gaylord Nelson decides to do it in October of 69 after the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in Rouge River, and that you had the Santa Barbara oil spill in 69, and Gaylord's going to have this massive protest for Earth and save the Earth. And Nixon wanted to know who. He started finding, like, whether it was Duke University or Stanford or, Boulder, there's somebody was having a little Earth Day office. And Nixon wanted to get answers. Who's paying for this Earth Day? And he found the answer, and you guys will not believe who paid for Earth Day in 1970. Virtually wrote the check for all of it. Walter Reuther, the head of the United Automobile Workers. It was a Labor Green Alliance back then. And Reuther's plane went down a couple days after Earth Day. He was killed with his wife, and a weird part had been taken out of a plane, and he crashed. And I'm not making a correlation that he was the Earth Day. I'm just saying that happened just days afterwards. But Reuther was the old union type that why should my worker in Flint, Michigan, they're not going to get to go to Yosemite. But they need to be able to swim in their local river, local pond, have local parks that are clean, and enjoy nature. It should be a Bill of Rights, a birthright for working people to have outdoor recreation. And Reuther fought for that, tooth and nail. And so Earth Day success, he was a big part of it. But Nixon started then, after that, you started getting, many things happened. I think really for environmental justice today, it's the birth of the Black Caucus in Congress in 1971. And I would give the credit, if I had to, there are many, but Ron Dellums, who was a congressperson from Oakland, Berkeley, started adopting civil rights and morphing it with Sierra Club and, David Brower and Dellums all, and then it's grown. By the 1980s, it became, John Lewis was a big part of connecting civil rights to it, and I interviewed him for this book. Andy Young told me, Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 was a civil rights event. The point of sitting in the back of a bus without air conditioning is the diesel would come in back where you were breathing the dirty air if you were black. And so the integration of buses is also can be seen from an environmental justice lens. And now today, it's just a huge issue over time. And I don't have a moment to talk about indigenous people and what's happened to them with uranium mining. So, oh my God, I mean, it's a whole other hour.
Yeah, so many lessons for the modern environmental movement to learn as we continue to try to address the disparities and how all of those landmark conservation laws are implemented. But yes, it's really neat to hear about a couple of characters and stories that you think deserve more mainstream attention, since so many of the key people and pivotal moments in the books are common names. So could you drop a couple more for us to look up afterwards?
Well,
some unsung stories.
Well, there're just so many. But I like writing a lot. I write books a lot, and there's some writers that really have moved me. And one was Edward Abbey, who wrote in '68, that tumultuous year, 1968. Edward Abbey wrote Desert Solitaire, about being a park ranger in Moab. If you haven't read Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey, you must. It's really a remarkable book on many different levels. And I would just say that same year, Stuart Brand brought out the Whole Earth Catalog. And then Native American writers started winning Pulitzer Prizes and awards of talking about Earth. The beat poet Gary Snyder won a Pulitzer thinking about Earth Island. And Gary Snyder's still alive. He was who Jack Kerouac based his novel, The Dharma Bums, on. But Gary Snyder is really interesting because it's not going to happen, guys. So you could say, but that's why you take literature classes or do seminar, come to events like this. I learned from Snyder how it broke down how, like, the United States should be organized by ecological region. Meaning California makes no sense, or Colorado, they're all different. So he would, like, from the parts of Glacier Bay, Alaska, all the way down to Santa Cruz, California, should be a state. Or, you get what I mean? He would divide it by how the nature works, and because the needs are so different. What's needed up along coastal California, up in Eureka and Redwood country, is very different than their needs down in San Diego, even though they're both in California, for water needs, air needs, environmental needs, logging needs, wildlife restoration, etc. Instead, we're just still living by these lines drawn like Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, da-da-da-da-da. And so Gary Snyder, if you haven't read, is really worth taking a look at.
Thank you, my pen exploded.
And women are all through my book and through the environmental movement. It was Women Strike for Peace that led to the banning of nuclear testing. And next year, a writer I love, Annie Dillard, it will be 50 years of a pilgrim at Tinker Creek.
Yeah, wow.
50th anniversary of that book. The people writing about nature were really quite remarkable. Walt Disney contributed. Because he did true life adventures, and his documentaries brought people in. For the first time, people were looking at a coyote or a wolverine predator from a different eyes than something that needed to be exterminated. By showing their interior lives, even though he fantasized parts and all, it's still, he had made a documentary called Seal Rock about Alaskan seals, and he won an Academy Award for documentary. And no human, no talking in a documentary, classical music, and just showing the daily habits of seals. And this is Walt Disney at his prime, and they wouldn't distribute it.
Oh, wow.
Because who's going to come see seals? So Walt Disney, rented a theater in California, LA, and if you show it for enough nights, like 3 nights of an empty theater, it qualifies for an Academy Award.
Oh, my goodness.
As a theatrical release. And he won the Academy Award for a movie just on seals.
How about that?
And he was a conservative Republican in many ways. Walt Disney had a very soft heart for wildlife protection. And to be fair, Republican Party in this era, there are many great John Salyer, a congressman from Pennsylvania, is like the fighter for wild and scenic rivers without dams. And, it was a different era. 50 years ago, guys, right now, 50 years, the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah.
Guess what it passed the Senate by? 92-0. Because us, the people, demanded it. It wasn't that some of these congressmen or senators were green, or they just heard us saying, we want the bald eagle saved. We want California condor saved. We want manatee saved. We want clean air. We want Lake Erie to come back. We don't want our rivers on fire. The public demanded it. And you have all sorts of states doing novel things. I focus a little bit, probably too much maybe, on Oregon in my book, but they did recycling, bottle recycling, and that ideas that even today you walk in the lobby, you'll see the recycling bins, and all that's emerging out of this period.
So, Doug, you write that you consider Silent Spring to be a hope machine along these lines, reminding readers that our own times are not uniquely oppressive and that everyday people and nonprofit groups retain the capacity to fight for a green tomorrow in the United States and around the world. Those are your words. However, many people today feel despairing about the challenges we face and also feel powerless to make any difference as an individual. So in our final couple minutes here, how do you feel we can win people's belief that there is hope for a green tomorrow, that individuals' dedication, vision, and actions really can make a difference?
I got very despairing. I was closing this book, and I needed to close my preface, and I made a big deal about Lady Bird Johnson saving redwood trees in Redwood National Park, and redwood trees all across I knew where her activities had been with Lawrence Rockefeller, another Republican who did a lot of incredible things in this period, and there was a fire coming on the trees. And I was like, my God, how am I writing about heroism of Lawrence Rockefeller and Lady Bird Johnson saving these redwood groves when they're about to burn? And then on TV, I saw the fire people sweating in that heat, putting out the fires, putting a foil around these giant old trees, doing everything a human could to protect this ancient redwood grove, and they saved it. And so even though I was in despair, I saw that spirit of those firefighters. I saw what, that's still going on there. And then I've been teaching guys a long time, and you really don't want your teacher to be a bummer that the apocalypse is coming. They're 20 years old. And they've already brought that on themselves. Many are in despair. They're blaming the baby boomers and Generation X, and they're angry that they're inheriting a planet that's burning, that we haven't done anything. I document in my book, we've known clearly about climate change since 1958. Kennedy gets a pass. I mean, there was a memo circulating. I don't think he read it. It was just so early what Roger Revelle and these guys were discussing. So Lyndon Johnson gave a speech about it. I've read in the book a frightening letter. Do you guys remember the name Daniel Patrick Moynihan? He writes, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic advisor, I've been dealing with the weather people and looking into this very deeply, and if the scientists are right, we are in big trouble with climate change. He writes to Nixon, goodbye Miami, goodbye New York City, what happens to Seattle is uncertain. In a letter in 1969 to Nixon. I wanted to do a follow-up to this book on presidents and climate change. I'd be lying to you if I told you any of them did anything. It's not their fault. They couldn't. It's for all the complicated reasons. Some people try more than others. Biden, you saw, has just done a lot trying. Where Al Gore, if he got elected, may have done what TR did and put it first, but he didn't get elected. And so it's a time to be in despair, but we can't. So you just got to be hopeful, and you got to fight and and don't always have to think, how do we get off fossil fuels? The big thing, if you're young, I tell them, if you can do that, good, but if not, just adopt a local, be a friends of Big Bend National Park. Worked on an endangered species project, work with the zoology part, work with a waterway thing. We need you. We need every hand on deck, so join a group, go to the meetings, pay a little fee, add to the newsletter, be engaged, because I think eventually when the fourth wave comes, like first wave TR, second wave FDR, third, these three presidents, when the fourth wave is climate, it's global, it's China, it's India, it's almost impossible. The mechanisms through innovation are kicking in. I think by 2030, when California, Oregon, Washington, and others stop allowing the selling of fossil fuel vehicles in the states, things will start. But in the meantime, join something and be engaged. Don't just be in despair, or certainly don't get depressed. It's not worth it. And I learned, and I'll end by saying David Brower of the Sierra Club, the one thing I learned from him, because he talked to students groups and what they did in the 60s and 70s. It's so stupid. I hate to leave you with this. But he said, tell them kids to have fun saving the planet. Have fun. Get out there. Go, and that's what we got to do.
Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
And thank you for, yes. Thank you for everything you've done for the history of conservation, and what a fascinating 45 minutes. Now, folks, we have 15 minutes left, so this is your opportunity to ask Doug whatever is in your heart. I'm going to do my best to call on some folks, and then we have mic runners in the audience. So, yes, sir, right on the edge. Go ahead.
What is your historical perspective on the recent Supreme Court rulings on environmental control?
I find it outrageous, and it's horrific what's going on. And there's a concerted effort to undo the Nixon-era legislation, to water down till it's meaningless the Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. And that's because of a captive corporate interest that don't like being regulated. And there's this deregulatory movement. They're getting big successes, and they have the Supreme Court, by and large, backing their action. So we've got these laws. We've just got to back them and keep them and not move backwards. You saw what's happened, Roe v. Wade, and this is happening on these environmental legislation. It's weird, but they're going after Nixon's era of legislation. They're not, and Johnson's. They're not worried about what Kennedy did. They're really about, Ronald Reagan in his diary very astutely wrote, they were building an FDR memorial in Washington, go to it. And he, to the Post, falsely, Washington Post said that Reagan wasn't for the FDR memorial. Well, in his diary, he said, I hate the Post for saying that. I voted 4 times for FDR. My father wouldn't have survived the Great Depression, an alcoholic father, without the work relief programs. What I want to do was undo the Great Society. And so the project at hand on today's Trump revolution and its supporters is really to undo this group of legislation that allowed extraction industries fossil fuel industries to be hyper-regulated by the federal government, and they're doing everything they can to turn back those epic conservation bills, which is ironic at a time when we need them more than ever. And so we'll see how it plays out.
Thank you. Go ahead, right here in the third row in the middle.
Thank you very much. I love hearing about the history of this. One of my favorite pieces was Rachel's earlier work on tide pools and whatnot. But bringing it back up to date, and to spin off of what you just said, I'd like you to go a little bit deeper for the people in this room. What you might be referring to, I think, is called Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation and others that would block the expansion of the electrical grid for wind and solar energy / funding for EPA, all kinds of stuff on day one of the GOP administration, that they're ready to go and undo these things. Can you go a little bit deeper on this and tell people in this room what we might do to stop this?
You should have kept Mark Udall in as a U.S. Senator from Colorado. That would have, he was a great conservationist, Mark Udall. But truth, guys, what happened was all these wins, and I've touched on barely any, but there are a ton of them in the 60s. Everything dies in 73 with the Arab oil embargo. And the leading figure in my book, as you will know, is William O. Douglas, the Supreme Court justice who was fighting on behalf of the environment, saved the C&O Canal. He saved the Buffalo River in Arkansas. He stopped dams and doing it. And Douglas, where they try to impeach Douglas for his environmentalism, his counterpart was a man, Lewis Powell, who was head of the tobacco industry. And he writes in 71, the famous Powell Memorandum, which you can pull up on your phone tomorrow or when we leave here. Powell writes to the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the liberals, Rachel Carson's, Ralph Nader's, blah, blah, blah. They have won. They own the professors, the universities, the Marcuse and, all the 60. They've taken over ABC, CBS, NBC. It's going to be a 30-year to 40-year project. We have to build an entire other infrastructure of lecture series, of television networking, of talk radio, of think tanks, to stop this, what they interpreted environmentalism as a regulatory movement against capitalism. And lo and behold, you get the Federalist Society, and you get the Cato Institute, and you get the Heritage Foundation, and you get, this has been a project of theirs. They simply are winning. They've scored big wins, and when Trump got them 3 Supreme Court justices in, man, they're on a roll. And so they're in a roll, and that they really are. But I don't want you to think it's just Trump. Trump's irrelevant. It's just been at the core. It's been a question of what is federal overreach, how much, how far. And because it was so bipartisan with Nixon, as I said, 92-0, people thought that marker wouldn't be moved. But now we're seeing that there's an attempt to if not abolish those, but to reform them to fit more into the extraction companies' view of the world.
Thank you. I see the next question right here in the middle.
Powell became a Supreme Court justice in 72, the next year. And it's really interesting, intellectual square-off. You could do Lewis Powell versus William O. Douglas. Their views on these issues are just like this, but they were both brilliant.
Interesting.
Doug, I read in the LA Times that prominent environmental groups like the Sierra Club are facing huge declines in membership and revenue as well as political influence, and that the environmental movement is struggling to recapture that momentum. I'm just wondering how you would suggest we should go about a strategy for resuscitating what you've been talking about tonight that seems to be declining today.
It's a great question. I mean, all of these nonprofits of the 60s and 70s, not all, but a lot of them are being seen by today's left, if you like, we're progressives, as being too white elite, outdoor adventure, expendable wealth people. and meaning there's a frontal attack on groups that used to be of the left, like the Wilderness Society and Sierra Club Audubon Society, from progressives. For example, today, the Audubon Society, they're talking about getting rid of Audubon's name because it's John James Audubon, who you all know for painting these incredible drawings of North American birds, but he also not only was pro-slavery, but owned slaves and traded slaves. So there is a massive effort to get rid of the Audubon Society's name, and chapters in Seattle and Portland are doing just that. And here's National Audubon has been like a symbol of environmental conservation stewardship, and now people are saying no, those were outdoor white privilege cults. The Sierra Club has put Ben Jealous, used to be head of the NAACP, to run the Sierra Club to start bringing in environmental justice issues. So all of the older groups like that are going through a massive amount of transition. Where the 60s and 70s activists, let's call it Carsonism, won is really at the universities. There is no school in America that doesn't offer environmental science, ecology. You all probably have a niece, a nephew, or somebody who's going into environmental something. Ecology got inserted into the thinking, and it's there. And so guys, there was no even term environmental in 1965. All right, it didn't. At the time of Earth Day, it wasn't even being used in '70. Now, environmental, you can't turn and not seeing environmental programs, environmental this, and that's the triumph of environmental law. And that was born really in 1967 with the group Environmental Defense Fund that ran by the slogan, "Sue the Bastards." And what brings a company today, if you were, Exxon or something, what you don't like is class action suits brought on by environmental lawyers, and so there are all sorts of strategies now to avoid that. But environmental law is what's probably where the money is now. The groups that are really in the game in the 21st century are National Resource Defense Council or the Sierra Club's perhaps Defense Fund, but it's more about suing. It's lost some of the creative edge. Yes, Greta's made news and, is talked about around the world, but just pick like circa 1970 and look at the music. I mean, you had Pete Seeger saving the Hudson River to clean scenic Hudson, and Joni Mitchell writing, Big Yellow Taxi. They paved Paradise and put up and put up a parking lot, and Marvin Gaye, Mercy Me, the ecology. And so this was what I'm saying, was really a movement. And today we're very divided. In 1960, scientists were the referees on a lot of environmental things. So I was mentioning in 1960, Time magazine chose scientist as the person of the year. Cut to today, people will say it depends on who buys the scientist. Well, that's not real science. As a group, scientists don't carry the same clout, nor does journalism. When Walter Cronkite comes in on January 1, 1970, and says, we're making 1970 the year of the environment, the moonwalk's over, Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin went on the moon, this is going to be the environmental year, and every night on CBS started showing, dead fish and oil spill or thing. It had a big impact. And when Bill Anders' famous photograph, Earthrise, of all these astronauts going into space, but they came back talking about lonely blue-green planet Earth floating, and this Earth thing, and it all was in favor of this environmental movement. And today, you don't see it talked about. Yes, this summer it has, because of the record-breaking temperatures. There's no question there's a sea change. But many groups of people are believing that technology will figure this out, that it's too late. I think climate denying is no longer accepted. I mean, I know you can find somebody but I think the new thing is that, yes, climate's changing, but so what? It's always changed, and it might be man-made, but we'll figure out strategies to cope with it. Meanwhile, innovation in a capitalist free market will eventually come up with things where an electric car or a solar car or whatever will eventually be cost effective, and you will have a new revolution of some kind that kicks in, but it's not a light switch. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And then we could be on gasoline for another 30, 40 years. It could be 20, but it's not going away tomorrow.
Thank you for those thoughts, Doug. So in our last 2 minutes here, would love to ask you to read that passage from Silent Spring Revolution that I gave to you that I think really resonates with this idea that an understanding of the past can help us shape the future.
All right. I'm doing this for my friend, Denali. People can reverse the damage of the planet with Carson-like conviction, a thoughtful ecological conscience, an understanding of Dr. Albert Schweitzer's reverence for life philosophy, and a reasoned trust in fact-based science. If nothing else, I hope Silent Spring Revolution helps readers reconnect with America's public lands and freshwater resources, our lakes, our mountains, rivers, seashores, islands, deserts, marshes, and woods, and their migrant inhabitants. Thank you, guys. Thank you.